"Make the most of the daytime," advised the hungry tiger gloomily, "for tonight you are supposed to be eaten and will have to hide down below till we find some way out of Rash." It was not a pleasant prospect, and though Carter did what he could to keep things cheerful, Betsy and the barber grew quieter and quieter as the afternoon advanced. No more prisoners were flung over the wall, and as the first stars twinkled out, the three slipped silently into the underground cave. The hungry tiger had just pushed the pink paving stone back when Irashi and Ipti, preceded by the pink guards bearing torches, stepped out upon the wall. "Good evening, furious feline," called Ipti shrilly.
How do you do, and how do you do it?
"He's eaten the entire lot," he explained in a breathless whisper to Irashi. "We've brought you some dessert," announced the Pasha, who seemed to be in a high good humor. "A tempting little waif. Throw the little waif over," he called playfully to the guards. The hungry tiger had immediately turned his back upon these rash rascals, but as a crumpled little bundle came tumbling down beside him, he swung around. What he saw made him roar so ferociously that Irashi, Ipti, and the pink guards covered their ears and fled from the wall. "What's he saying?" gasped the Pasha, sinking down on a pink settee and clapping his fat hands to his quivering middle. "He's talking tiger, your highness," stuttered Ipti with a slight shudder, "and tiger is a language I never studied. But never mind, from now on we are the sole rulers of Rash." Thumping the Pasha upon the back, Ipti led him into the throne room. As soon as they had gone, the hungry tiger stopped roaring and gently approached the small prisoner. "Don't cry," begged the hungry tiger miserably. It was dreadful to have everyone afraid of him, especially a helpless little boy. "Why, he's no older than Betsy," thought the hungry tiger, bristling with anger at Irashi's wickedness. "If you stop crying, I'll take you for a ride all round the courtyard," he promised breathlessly. This offer so astonished the little fellow that he took his arm from before his face and blinked through his tears at the huge beast. There was no mistaking the kindly expression in the hungry tiger's eyes, and with a gasp of relief he jumped up and was about to mount the great beast when a thin figure leapt from the top of the wall and came hurtling down between them. Spare him, cruel monster," wheezed the newcomer hoarsely. "I am old and thin, but eat me instead." Placing himself between the hungry tiger and the boy, the old rasher extended his arms pleadingly. It was Fizzenpop, and as the hungry tiger drew back with embarrassment and surprise, the Grand Vizier of Rash flung himself at his feet. "It is the Scarlet Prince," panted Fizzenpop, beating his head up and down upon the stones. "Prince Everett of Rash." "Who?" warned the hungry tiger, looking about uneasily. Then, as Fizzenpop continued his entreaties, he held up his paw for silence. "You're a nice old bone," sighed the hungry tiger, "but even so, I have no desire to eat you." "It's my conscience," he continued heavily. "I've lived among people too long to hold a position like this." The Grand Vizier could scarcely believe his ears. "But the other prisoners," he demanded wildly. "You have eaten them." The hungry tiger, with a tired shake of his head, waved toward the loosened paving stone. The two corn ears of the vegetable man were sticking up through the crevice, and he was carefully repeating to those below everything as it happened. "How can I ever thank you?" exclaimed Fizzenpop, prostrating himself again at the hungry tiger's feet. "Don't thank me, help me," begged the hungry tiger uncomfortably. "And tell me more about this little chap. Perhaps together we can plan a way to escape." Fizzenpop's brave action in offering himself in place of the little prince made the hungry tiger feel terribly ashamed. More and more he was coming to realize that he would never be able to devour a live man. It was a long story, and sitting down beside the water tub with Prince Everett in his lap, the Grand Vizier told how Irashi had stolen the throne of the kingdom and made himself Pasha of Rash. There are 3 magic rubies to protect the rightful rulers of Rash, explained Pop in a low voice. One protects him from all danger by water, one protects him from all injury in the air, and the other from all harm on the earth or under the earth. The rubies are embedded among other gems in the Rash scepter. No sooner had Everett's father retired than Irashi began to scheme and plan to make himself king. Knowing he could do nothing while the Rash rubies were in our possession, he managed, with Ipti's help, to steal the royal scepter. Next he had the little prince seized and hidden away. After searching in vain for many months, I chanced yesterday into a Rash cobbler's shop and found Everett playing with the cobbler's children. Hoping to get him safely out of the country, I hurried him back to the palace, but Irashi soon discovered him and the rest. Pop groaned heavily. The rest, you know. But what became of the rubies? Asked the hungry tiger as Pop continued to stroke the head of the little prince. So much had happened in the last few hours that even Pop's story could not keep the prince awake. One he hurled from the highest turret of the palace, another he flung into the Rash River, and the last he buried somewhere in the garden, answered the Grand Vizier sadly. Until we recover the 3 magic rubies, the prince's very life is in danger, and Rash must remain under the wicked rule of Irashi the Rough. Every evening, when I am unobserved, I have searched most diligently for these precious gems, but without any success. Well, Irashi won't rule long if I can find a way out of here, growled the hungry tiger. Think, man, is there no way out? Pop shook his head dejectedly, and then, as it was growing late, they thought it best to conceal the little prince with the rest of the prisoners. Betsy, called the hungry tiger softly. There was no answer, and, pulling aside the pink paving block, he peered down into the cavern. They must be asleep, muttered the hungry tiger in surprise. Here, Mr. Pop, you keep watch while I lower the boy. It was too dark to see, and after the hungry tiger had eased the ragged little prince into the cave, he decided to step in himself and see how everything was going. So he slipped gently down into the darkness. For nearly 10 minutes, Pop kept an anxious eye upon the wall. Then, feeling he had given the hungry tiger ample time to replace the block, he turned round. There was no one in the courtyard. Merciful mustard, gasped the Grand Vizier, dashing over to the opening. Hanging down by his heels, he glared into the damp little chamber. But it was perfectly empty. No tiger, no prince, no barber. No anything. Falling in head first, Pop began feeling all over the walls and floors. Then, as his search yielded nothing, he raised his voice in a long, dismal wail. What's wrong? 3 Rash guards appeared sleepily on the wall, and presently Irashi himself, wrapped in a pink bathrobe, rushed out to see what was the matter. The tiger, gulped Pop wildly. The hungry tiger has escaped. Pop was already in great disfavor owing to his discovery of the lost prince, and realizing instantly that it would never do to tell Irashi the whole truth, he resolved to save himself for his country and Everett by a clever story. So, while Irashi listened breathlessly from the wall, he told how he had come out to observe the great creature from Oz, how he had seen him prying up a paving stone and had sprung into the courtyard to prevent him from escaping. But I was too late, lamented Pop, shaking his head mournfully. The hungry tiger has disappeared by some miracle of magic. And such a useful beast, sniffed Irashi. But you shall be rewarded, Pop, for this brave action. And ordering the guards to let down ropes to the Grand Vizier, the Pasha of Rash went regretfully back to bed. Oh, well, he yawned as he dropped into a doze. He's eaten that pest of a prince, and that is something. Chapter 7. Escape from Rash. After the hungry tiger had pushed back the pink block, Betsy and her 2 companions settled themselves as comfortably as they could in the little cavern. It was too dark to see, but they could hear the sad singer crooning drearily to himself. Carter immediately ran his fingers along the floor. Fortunately, it was stone. "No danger of taking root here," he whispered in a relieved voice to Betsy. "Hello, what's that racket?" That racket, as we already know, was Irashi and the Pink Guardsman, and as the noise continued, the Vegetable Man, who was tallest, stuck his ears through the crevice between the blocks. What Carter heard through his corn ears was simply amazing, and as he immediately repeated it to the little company below, they soon forgot their discomfort in their interest. When Fizz-n-Pop explained who the last prisoner was, the barber threw his shaving mug joyfully into the air and began to prance wildly up and down upon the shins of the sad singer. "3 cheers for the Scarlet Prince," roared the barber, thumping on the wall with his razor. "3 cheers for Prince Everett of Rash."
Be quiet,
begged Betsy anxiously.
they'll hear you. Oh, hush.
But the barber refused to be restrained and continued to thump enthusiastically upon the wall. Withdrawing his ears from the crevice, Carter groped about in the dark in an effort to stop the reckless fellow, but at the third snatch, the whole side of the cavern fell away and pitched the entire company into a dark, damp tunnel. Carter managed to slip his arm round Betsy Bobbin as he fell past her, and they could hear the sputter and groans of the rash barber and the singer far below.
Anyway,
Gasped Betsy as they skidded down the slippery passageway together.
anyway, we're out of Rash.
"Is this anyway?" groaned the Vegetable Man, trying to keep himself and Betsy right side up. "Well, if this is anyway, I prefer some other way."
Phew.
Betsy was about to reply when the floor of the tunnel dropped out and they fell straight downward, then, striking a rubbery incline, shot straight upward. The rest of the trip was more like a rush through a scenic railway tunnel than anything Betsy ever had experienced. Upslides, downslides, round loops, bends, and curves swooped the rash prisoners till there was no breath left in any one of them. And when, after a half-hour of it, they shot out into the open, they lay for nearly 5 minutes, perfectly motionless where they had fallen. Then the rash singer sat up and in a strangled voice quavered, we're down and out of Rash, and everything has gone to smash. Sniff, sniff. A trip like this upsets me, but how we got here is what gets me." Probably he would have continued his song indefinitely, but at that minute all of Carter's vegetables, which had slid more slowly down the tunnel, sprayed out of the opening and simply overwhelmed him. Betsy had not breath enough to laugh, but Carter, not being so easily winded, sprang up and ran to the singer's assistance. "They always throw things when I sing," sobbed the poor fellow, as Carter helped him to his feet, and a little defiantly he repeated his last stanza, "Sniff, sniff." "A trip like this upsets me, but how we got here is what gets me." "It gets me too," mumbled the barber, rolling over and looking around for his razor. "1 minute there we are, and next minute there we ain't. Strikes me this ground is pretty soft." "Why, it's down," he puffed, blowing a ball of fuzz from the end of his nose. Betsy, pulling up a handful of what she supposed to be grass, found her fingers full of feathers, for they had landed in the very center of a field of down. "Well, this probably saved us from breaking our heads, but how did it all happen?" repeated the barber, looking over at Carter in perfect bewilderment. "It was your fault," answered the Vegetable Man gravely. "You must have touched some secret spring when you pounded on the wall." "I don't know whether to thank you or not," sighed Carter, rubbing his thin ankles doubtfully. "I hope you didn't bark your shins on the tunnel," murmured the barber solicitously. "No," answered Carter frankly. "I didn't bark my shins, for they are bark already, but you've ruined my business." He looked ruefully at his scattered vegetables. They had not stood the trip at all well and were lying about in squashed heaps. "Never mind, buddy." The barber clapped Carter comfortably on the back. "Maybe you can pick up some more down here. But where is here, I wonder?" "Well, any place is better than Rash," exclaimed Betsy, looking about curiously. "The last time I fell through a tunnel I went clear to the other side of the world." Do you suppose this is the other side of the world? Look, there's the moon. It's square, whispered the sad singer in a frightened voice.
And it's green,
he added dismally. The moon is there. But never trust a moon that's square. It's shining squarely on our heads. We'll all be slaughtered in our beds. You don't know what you're singing about, declared the barber gruffly. A square moon is better than no moon, and there aren't any beds that I can see, but there's a town over yonder. Look! Not far away, shadowy and mysterious in the green light of the square moon, rose the towers and spires of a strange city.
Well, I wish the Hungry Tiger were here,
cried Betsy Bobbin. And the little prince. I wonder if the cave wall closed up after it slid us down here. Whiz, whir, bang! As if in answer to Betsy's question, the two came sailing out of the tunnel, circled through the air, and landed close beside Betsy. And while the Hungry Tiger was still puffing and panting with indignation and surprise, the little girl flung her arms about his neck and told him the whole story of their flight through the mysterious passageway. Slowly the big beast got his breath back, and as he blew the downy feathers from his nose, the rash barber, with great ceremony, introduced the little prince to Betsy Bobbin. In the green moonlight she saw a pleasant, freckle-faced little boy of about her own age. His nose turned up, his collar turned down, and in spite of his ragged clothes he had a most kingly bearing. Betsy knew at once that they would be friends. Prince Everett himself liked the little girl immediately, and after they had compared notes on their terrible fall, he begged her to tell him more about the vegetable man. "Is he really real?" asked the little prince, scarcely taking his eyes from Carter's curious figure. Betsy nodded and told him all about her meeting with the vegetable man, her trip across the deadly desert, and of their arrival in Rash. She was going on to tell him a little about Ozma and the Emerald City, but the sad singer had started such a sleepy song of welcome to honor the little prince that she could not keep her eyes open. Everett, too, soon began to nod, and as the Hungry Tiger had wisely determined not to investigate the strange city till morning, they all curled up in the fields of down and were soon fast asleep. All but Carter Green. Since turning to a vegetable he did not require rest, and all night long he paced up and down the white feathery field, thinking his own queer thoughts and keeping a loving watch over his new and interesting friends. Chapter 8. In downtown, when Betsy awakened next morning, she saw the Hungry Tiger and Carter staring curiously at a huge sign in the corner of the field. "Down!" ordered the sign sternly. "No uppers allowed." "That means us, I suppose," said Carter, scratching his corn ear reflectively. "I wonder what kind of people live down here. Geese," spluttered the Hungry Tiger, looking cross-eyed at a fluff of feathers that had lighted on the end of his nose. "Wish I could catch a couple. I'm so hungry." "So am I," agreed Betsy, "and I don't see a thing to eat, do you?" "Nothing but sunbeams," mused Carter, "and they'd make a pretty light breakfast, but we ought to be glad there's a sun so far underground." "Why shouldn't there be?" snapped the Hungry Tiger. Being hungry made him a bit irritable. "Doesn't the sun go down every day?" Betsy and Carter exchanged startled glances, for neither of them had thought of this, and the little girl, gazing dreamily across the soft fields, began to wonder what exciting adventures and strange experiences lay ahead of them. But the Hungry Tiger was more interested in food. "Maybe there'll be something to eat in the city," he wheezed in a weak voice. "Let's waken the others." Prince Everett and the sad singer were already up, and after a few shakes and thumps on the back, the rash barber lifted his head. "What's up?" he inquired sleepily. "Nothing," giggled Betsy. "Don't you remember we all fell down?" "Don't remember a thing since I hit the feathers," yawned the barber, plucking a tuft of down from his beard. "Well, this is down," laughed Betsy, pointing to the sign. "And time to get up," added the Hungry Tiger gruffly. "We're going off to that city over there to see if we can find some breakfast. Jump on my back, Betsy, and you too." The Hungry Tiger nodded at the ragged little prince. "What do they call you?" he asked kindly. "The Scarlet Prince, the son of Asha, Prince Everett of Rash, the Pasha," droned the sad singer with a deep salam toward the youthful ruler. "All that?" gasped the hungry tiger, putting back his ears. "Oh, call me Reddy," exclaimed the little boy, hopping up behind Betsy. "I haven't been prince for a year, you know, and that's what Pop called me even when I was." "Well, I wish Pop were here now," sighed the hungry tiger regretfully. "Too bad the trapdoor closed before he found it." The tiger had a great admiration for the Grand Vizier of Rash, and determined to do all in his power to restore Reddy to his throne.
"Tell us more about the magic rubies,"
begged Betsy, as the tiger started briskly across the fields of down. "Yes, do," urged the vegetable man. "We dropped out right in the middle of the story, and most of it was knocked out of my head." Carter was trudging along beside the hungry tiger, but the barber and the singer, thinking it presumptuous to walk so close to the prince, had dropped respectfully behind. So while the strange little procession moved toward the unknown city, Prince Everett told again how Irashi had stolen the precious rubies and made himself Pasha of Rash. "Well, I don't see how you'll ever find them," murmured Betsy when he had finished the story and told a little of his life with the cobbler's children. "Nothing's impossible," Carter reminded her gaily. "Look at me." Betsy and the little prince both had to grin, for the vegetable man did look impossible, and yet there he was. "But how would you know the rubies if you did find them?" asked Betsy after a little pause. "There is an R cut in each one," explained Reddy gravely, "and they are square." "R," shouted Carter, snatching out a stalk of his celery. "R, parsnips and peonies, radishes and rhubarb." Seizing the leather pouch from about his neck, the vegetable man dumped its whole contents into Betsy's lap. "Stop!" begged Carter, grasping the hungry tiger by the tail. "Stop, I think I've discovered something." "To eat?" questioned the hungry tiger, looking round eagerly. Without answering, Carter picked up the ruby he had already showed to Betsy Bobbin. "Square!" puffed Carter triumphantly, "and it has an R cut on the side." "Why, it's one of the Rash rubies!" screamed the prince, nearly tumbling off the tiger. "Where did you find that?" Passing the beautiful gem from one to the other, Carter explained how he had found it in a potato he had bought from a gypsy. "But which ruby is it?" panted the barber, pressing forward. "It might be the one Irashi flung from the castle window, or it might be the one he buried in the garden." "Let me give your highness a tiny cut with my razor," he suggested brightly. "Then, if it does not hurt, we will know that it is the ruby that protects you from danger on the earth or under the earth." Everett looked a little doubtful, and the hungry tiger shook his head impatiently. "Too risky," growled the tiger. "Let his highness climb yonder tree," proposed the singer, waving toward a feather fan tree that stood not far away. "Then let him fall out. If he breaks no bones, we will know it is the ruby that protects him from danger in the air."
"Don't you do it!"
cried Betsy indignantly. "It might be the ruby that protects you from danger in the water. Then where'd you be?" "Let Reddy keep his ruby till danger threatens," advised the hungry tiger sternly. "I'm not going to have him sliced and broken if I can help it." And he flashed his yellow eyes so threateningly that the barber and singer fell back in confusion. "But wasn't it lucky we met Carter?" exclaimed Betsy, as the vegetable man slipped the ruby into Everett's pocket. "And if the King of Down lives in this city and can just show us the way up, maybe we can find the other rubies and—" "Something to eat," roared the hungry tiger, breaking into a quick step. "When I'm the Pasha, you shall have anything you wish," promised the little prince, smiling sideways at Carter Green. "You can be keeper of kites and marbles if you want. Betsy shall be queen, and the hungry tiger all the rest of the nobility." "Thanks," muttered the hungry tiger, grinning behind his whiskers. He knew that if he ever reached Oz in safety, nothing could tempt him away from the Emerald City again, not even his terrible appetite. "But what do the 3 R's stand for?" asked Carter. He had been turning the matter over in his mind for some time. "Readin', writin', and 'rithmetic," guessed Betsy Bobbin. "Rightful ruler of Rash," corrected Reddy with a cheerful bounce. Now that one of the magic rubies was in his possession, anything seemed possible. "Hurry up!" He called over his shoulder to the rash barber and singer. "We're almost there." And they almost were, for beyond a thin fringe of feather brush rose the high buildings and towers of the city they had seen in the moonlight. The trip across the fields of down had been rather tiresome. The feet of the travelers sank at each step into the soft feathers, so that even the hungry tiger was panting a little when they reached the city itself. Over the gates, creaking backward and forward in the brisk morning breeze, was a large silver sign. "Downtown," read Betsy, squinting a little in the bright sunshine. "Why, it looks just like downtown at home, Carter."
Home in Oz?
Queried the vegetable man, pressing his nose against the bars.
No, in Oklahoma, laughed Betsy hastily. But let's go in.
"I see stores and hotels and everything." "Hotels," gulped the hungry tiger, pricking up his ears. "Hotels! BRRR!" And before Betsy or anyone else could stop him, he had hurled himself headlong at the gates of downtown. With a creak and bang they burst open, and the whole Rash Company fell through. "Food!" roared the hungry tiger, charging at full speed down the main street. "Give us food!" At the tiger's roars, such citizens as were in the street stopped in horror and astonishment. Then, right and left like startled hares, they darted, huddling into doorways, scurrying into side alleys, tumbling over one another in their frenzy to get away. In fact, they were as amazed and terrified to see a tiger in their downtown as we would be to see one in ours, and when they glimpsed Carter Green, they ran faster than ever. "Stop!" shouted Betsy, flinging both arms around the tiger's neck to keep from falling off. "You're scaring everyone away. Stop! Here's a restaurant." But the hungry tiger had already seen the tempting display of pies and roast turkey in the window. Turning so sharply that the Prince of Rash tumbled off backward, he rushed through the swinging doors, and next minute they had the establishment to themselves. One look at the hungry tiger had been enough for the early morning customers. Grabbing their hats, and without waiting for their change, they pelted out the rear door of the shop, followed by 3 waiters and the screaming proprietor. "Oh, well," sighed Betsy, helping herself capably to a spring chicken that was turning slowly on a spit,
"if they won't stay to wait on us, we must just help ourselves."
"What fun!" chuckled Reddy, burying his nose in a cherry tart, while the barber and sad singer divided a huge sausage between them. The vegetable man, not requiring food, busied himself with counting the oranges and apples in the window, and wondered wistfully whether he could not find a cart somewhere and stir up some trade. But it was the hungry tiger who enjoyed himself most of all. At one side of the room 12 roasts were waiting their turn at the ovens. These the famished tiger snapped up in so many bites. After his long fast in Rash, they tasted perfectly delicious, and, while Reddy looked at him in astonishment and admiration, he swallowed 3 roast turkeys, a bowl of potato salad, and a tray full of biscuits. He was just starting on a huge ham, when a commotion in the doorway made them all spin round. It was the proprietor, and with him were 20 tall officers. They had a great net, and as the hungry tiger gave a convulsive swallow, they flung it over him and dragged the huge beast, the singer, the barber, Betsy, the vegetable man, and the little Prince of Rash out into the street. "Robbers!" screamed the proprietor savagely as they were hustled away. "Wait till Dad hears of this. Why don't you bite them?" wailed Betsy, trying to wriggle out of the grasp of the officer who had her by the arm. "Too full," mumbled the hungry tiger in a stuffy voice. "Couldn't eat another bite, not even a policeman. But it was worth it, and who's afraid of Dad? We've been arrested before and gotten away. We'll get off somehow, trust me."
"Maybe the ruby will help,"
said the little prince, squirming about so he could see Betsy. Carter, on the other side, gave her such an encouraging wink that the little girl stopped worrying and began to look around with real interest. Downtown, as Betsy had said, in the no motors nor wagons, and the men who crowded the streets were gaily costumed in green and yellow bills. 4 of the down officers had hold of the net entangling the hungry tiger. 1 officer had hold of each of the others, and the rest tramped importantly ahead of the procession.
Who's Dad?
Asked Betsy as they were propelled through the swinging doors of a large white bank. The king, answered the officer haughtily. Is he a kind king? Sniffed the sad singer nervously. What kind of a king is Dad? Will he make us happy or make us sad? You'll soon see, grunted the officer, pushing him roughly into an elevator. The others were thrust as unceremoniously after him. The car shot upward, and the next minute they were all marched out upon the roof. In a swivel chair on top of the bank sat Dad. He was reading a paper, and beside him on a high stool sat the most curious lady Betsy had ever seen, their Majesties, the King and Queen of Downtown, boomed the officer who had hold of Betsy Bobbin. Robbers, Your Highness, he announced with a low bow. Chapter 9. The Industry. At the officer's ringing words, King Dad lowered his paper, and as he got a good look at the hungry tiger, his chair fell forward with a crash. A tiger, Nance? Stuttered Dad, rolling his eyes wildly at the Queen. But it's tied, answered the Queen of Downtown calmly. What are the charges, officer? $99.68, answered the officer hoarsely, and leaning over, he handed Dad a long slip of paper. But we only wanted a little breakfast, began Betsy tremulously, and a little breakfast, wheezed Dad, and putting on his specs started to read off the list. 12 roasts, 4 turkeys, 1 spring chicken, 3 dozen tarts, 14 donuts, 1 ham and 24 biscuits, 3 quarts of potato salad, 1 6-pound sausage. Monstrous, muttered the Queen, tapping her foot indignantly on the floor. They shall pay well for this. Why, that's a mere bite for a fellow like me, rumbled the hunger tiger impatiently, and I ate most of it. Who are you? Demanded Dad, holding on to the arms of his chair and blinking nervously at the great beast. I am the hungry tiger of Oz, and these are my friends. We are on our way to the Emerald City. This little girl is Betsy Bobbin, and allow me to present the Vegetable Man and the Pasha of— Your tail drags, yawned Her Majesty, fanning herself with her handkerchief. Cut it short. Time is money down here, and the thing for you to do is to pay up and settle down. How clearly you put things, murmured Dad, looking affectionately at his Queen. Betsy had been staring at Her Highness in perfect astonishment, for she was made entirely of money. Her face and hair were of purest gold, her hands and feet of silver, and her dress was made from hundreds of yellow bills that crinkled crisply when she moved. Yet with all her glitter and brilliance she seemed to Betsy the hardest and most disagreeable being she had ever met. Dad himself looked kind and careworn, resembling vaguely many of the daddies Betsy had known in the United States. If he had just decided things for himself and not depended so much upon the Queen, Betsy would have liked him better. "Well, are you ready to pay up?" asked Dad, looking from one to the other of the travelers. $99.68, please.
But we haven't any money, explained
Betsy breathlessly. We started off in such a hurry, and you should not have come downtown if you had no money, muttered Dad reprovingly. How dare you be without money? Cried the Queen, springing up in a perfect fury. How dare you come downtown without money? Now, don't get frenzied, Finance, begged Dad, patting her anxiously on the hand. They can easily make some money, you know. His words seemed to soothe the Queen.
That's so,
she mused thoughtfully.
Anybody can make money downtown if they just try hard enough.
Almost pleasantly, she turned to Betsy. You, my child, purred the queen, resuming her seat. You may start as a cash girl. I myself was a cash girl once, she went on dreamily, and now look at me, finance queen of downtown. I'm simply made of money. Betsy looked and shuddered a little as she did so. She was about to tell the queen that she had no desire to be a cash girl when Finance haughtily held up her hand for silence. The lad shall be an office boy, she decided imperiously. Who did you say he was? A prince, growled the hungry tiger. A dry goods store will be the best place for him, murmured Dad. What can you two do? He demanded, looking over his specs at the barber and sad singer of Rash. Anything, anything, whined the frightened prisoners, bumping their heads together in their anxiety to please. Pooh, sniffed Dad scornfully. That means nothing whatsoever. Shampoo? Suggested the barber hopefully. Let me give your highness a little shave and haircut. Are you a barber? Asked Dad, looking at the rasher with more interest. If you're a barber, you can stay and welcome. There's always room for another barber downtown. Thank you, thank you. If your majesty will permit, the barber bowed apologetically to the Prince of Rash, I will remain here. I have always wanted to make money, he acknowledged frankly. Me too, gulped the sad singer eagerly. I've sung until I'm hoarse in Rash and never earned a cent in cash. He has a voice like a horse, whispered Dad in a loud aside to the queen. He sings like a jackass, agreed Her Majesty readily. But let him stay. Any kind of a noise goes downtown. Now as to these others? She rolled her golden eyes in perplexity and disapproval at the vegetable man and the hungry tiger. Then, evidently giving them up, cried in a loud voice, The audience is over and the prisoners are discharged. Let them make some money, pay up, and settle down. Well, goodbye, smiled Dad, picking up his paper with a sigh of relief. If you don't like the positions we have chosen for you, go down to the square and choose some others. Take them to the public square, he ordered, waving at the officers. So, much to Betsy's and the little prince's amusement, they were all hurried into the elevator, out of the bank, and marched along the streets of the city. A curious sign on the first corner puzzled Betsy very much. Downtown belongs to the daddies, said the sign severely. No aunts, mothers, or sisters allowed. Why, anybody can go downtown at home, exclaimed the little girl in surprise. I noticed there were no ladies about, observed Carter in an amused voice. The daddies have it all their own way here. As they passed along, Betsy looked curiously in the windows of the shops and offices and saw that everywhere the dads were making money. Some were making money out of leather, some were making money out of oil, and some were even making money out of old papers and rags. It looked quite simple. But there must be some trick to it, she whispered hurriedly to the Prince of Rash. I hope we don't have to stay here long. I won't be a cash girl. Prince Everard nodded emphatically, for he had no intention of becoming an office boy. Just then they came to the public square and were marched solemnly through the gates. Pick your tools and get started, ordered the first officer gruffly, and grumbling a little among themselves because the prisoners had got off so easily. The 20 tall downsmen tramped noisily back to their station. As soon as they had gone, the barber, with his razor, released the hungry tiger from the net. I wonder what they meant about tools, murmured Betsy, staring all around her. Why, what an enormous tree! It stood in the center of the square, spreading out in every direction, its branches weighted down with a most curious collection of objects. There was a small notice tacked on the trunk, and Everard and Betsy Bobbin hurried over to investigate. Industry, read the sign. Pick your trade, business, or profession here. Well, I've often heard of the big industries, gasped Carter Green, squinting up through the branches, but I never knew they looked like this. If we are to stay downtown, I suppose we had better pick our business at once,
Stay if you want to,
rumbled the Hungry Tiger impatiently. My business is to see that Betsy Bobbin gets safely back to Oz and to restore Reddy to his throne. I, for my part, am going to leave as soon as I can find an exit.
Maybe they won't let us,
faltered Betsy, looking uneasily over her shoulder. But the daddies were not paying the slightest attention to the little group in the square, and, greatly relieved, they turned back to the industry. Some of these things might prove useful, even if we did not remain here, muttered Carter. Why, there's a razor! Shouted the rash barber in delight, and springing into the air, he snapped it off the lower branch and began to finger it lovingly. I'd take that harp if I could just reach it, sighed the sad singer, looking wistfully aloft. I'll pick it for you, offered Prince Everett obligingly, and swinging up into the tree he broke the harp from its stem and dropped it into the singer's arms. See anything you want, Betsy, called the little prince, and pushing aside a cluster of paintbrushes, he peered down at her expectantly. But with so many things to choose from, it was hard to decide. There were thimbles and shears, bottles of ink, hammers, saws, buckets and mops, brooms and hoes, music rolls, miners' caps, rolling pins, cookbooks, compasses, and ship models. Everything, in fact, that a body would need to work with. While Reddy was waiting for Betsy to make up her mind, his curiosity carried him higher and higher into the branches. Carter, too, walked round and round the base of the tree, shaking his head and exclaiming from time to time with surprise and astonishment. But the Hungry Tiger had small use for a tree that produced nothing to eat, nor was he interested in money or making money. So, while the others examined the marvelous tree, he began looking for a way out, and presently was rewarded, for in the far corner of the square were steps leading down into what seemed to be a tunnel. Stretching his neck cautiously about the doorway, the Hungry Tiger spied some directions. "Take the subway here for uptown," said a sign. Here, I've found a way out," roared the Hungry Tiger joyfully. "What kind of a way?" cried Carter, stumbling over the wheelbarrow he had just plucked from the industry. "A subway," puffed the tiger. "Tell the rest of 'em quick. Come on," cried Carter, waving to the others. "The Hungry Tiger has found some way out." "I said subway," growled the tiger a bit temperishly. "Are you going to take that thing along with you?" The vegetable man looked lovingly at the wheelbarrow. "It was the nearest thing to a cart I could find," he murmured sadly, "and will come in very handy if I pick up some vegetables or fruit. So will this." He patted a small spade that had grown on the same branch with the wheelbarrow. "Hello, here they come now." At Carter's cries, the little Prince of Rash, who had been trying to decide between a policeman's club and a sword, plucked the sword and came crashing to earth, followed by several bottles of ink and an ironing board. "I may have to fight for my kingdom," he told Betsy importantly, "and this sword will help." Betsy nodded understandingly, and without waiting to pick anything for herself, she ran over to the Hungry Tiger. They were all anxious to leave downtown, and when Betsy told them a little about subways, she had often been in subways in the United States, the Hungry Tiger gave the signal to start. "We've forgotten the barber and the singer," exclaimed Betsy, pausing suddenly on the top step. But just then the two Rashers came hurrying over, and when the Hungry Tiger announced that they were going uptown and from there back to the marvelous land of Oz, both drew back. "I've had enough ups and downs in my life," sighed the barber, "and will remain here and make my fortune. By that time Prince Everett may, perchance, be restored to his throne. Then, and then only, will I return to Rash." The singer, after one look into the gloomy opening, declared that he, too, preferred to stay downtown. "With this harp and my beautiful voice, I will soon be a rich man," he assured them earnestly, and with many goodbyes and good wishes, the four travelers left them to make their fortunes. Long after they had descended the steps and entered the subway itself, they could hear the plaintive wails of the sad singer and the thrum of the harp he had picked from the industry. It was dim and mysterious in the underground passageway, and after looking in vain for a car or train to carry them uptown, Betsy began following the arrows painted on the whitewashed walls.
There ought to be a car somewhere,
Panted the little girl, after they had made at least 50 turns.
Try mine,
Invited Carter, and with a tired smile, Betsy dropped into the wheelbarrow. Reddy was riding the hungry tiger, and after they had proceeded for more than an hour, the arrows stopped altogether.
Well, this isn't like our subways at all,
exclaimed Betsy in disgust. When you take a subway at home, you get somewhere. Isn't this somewhere? Asked Carter, stooping a little so he could enter a rough stone cavern at the end of the tunnel. Whistling cheerfully, he trundled Betsy through the low doorway. The hungry tiger followed, sniffing the air suspiciously, and it must be confessed that the little rock chamber did not look very inviting. The walls were of jagged gray stone, the floor damp and slippery, and the whole place dismal and chilly as a vault. A feeble light flickered down from an opening in the ceiling, and after a discouraged look round, Betsy shook her head. "We'll have to go back downtown," she sighed sadly. "I'll have to be a cash girl after all." "No, you won't," called Reddy. He had jumped off the tiger and gone to examine the back of the cavern. "Here's a door." Hurrying over, the others saw that the little prince was right. "Cave in," roared the hungry tiger, reading the door plate over the little boy's shoulder. "Knock 3 times. Why, that's fine. If it's an inn, they'll surely have something to eat." "We can't get out, so we might as well go in," he finished with a playful wink at Carter. Stepping back a few paces, the hungry tiger ran at the door and bumped his head 3 times against the brass plate. At the third bump, the door of cave-in flew open, the floor of the cave itself tilted forward, and the 4 adventurers fell through. Stones and dirt rattled down after them, and the hungry tiger's growls mingled with the screams of Betsy and Everett as they went tumbling down into the darkness. Chapter 10. The Magic Spectacles. Kaliko, king of all the gnomes and metal monarch besides, sat gloomily on the jeweled rock throne in his underground cavern. "Nothing ever happens here," complained Kaliko, frowning at his royal chamberlain. "Let's have a war," proposed Goof, looking up from the ruby scepter he was polishing. "We haven't had a war since Ruggedo left."
Ruggedo!
shrilled Kaliko, stamping his foot furiously.
"How dare you mention that name in my presence? Begone, begone, and never speak to me again."
"Then I'll write," mumbled Goofa, and picking up his bottle of ruby polish unconcernedly, he left the throne room. Ruggedo was the former king and had ruled over the gnomes for many years. He had been deposed for his wickedness by a powerful djinn, and Kaliko was made monarch in his place. Later, Ruggedo had tried to capture Oz itself, and had been banished by Ozma to a lonely isle in the non-estic ocean. But wicked as Ruggedo had been, the gnomes often sighed for his return. Things had been more interesting during Ruggedo's reign, and though Kaliko was a good king, he was not half so interesting. Kaliko knew this, and any mention of the old gnome king always irritated him intensely. For several moments after Goof's departure, he continued to mutter and mumble with displeasure. Then, suddenly bethinking himself of a new invention of the chief wizard, he reached into his pocket and brought out a green case. In the case was a pair of pink spectacles, not merely spectacles, mind you, but X-spectacles, and the gnome wizard had assured the king that with them he could see events before they occurred. Kaliko had not yet tried this new contrivance, and still grumbling a little, he set the X-spectacles upon his nose and stared drearily at the rock wall in front of him. He really did not expect anything to happen. Therefore, when 4 figures appeared suddenly upon the wall, he gave a start of astonishment. Reflected upon the rock surface as clearly as if it were a moving picture, he could see 4 people making their way through the lost labyrinth at the southern end of his dominions. "Goof, Goof!" shrieked the Gnome King, pounding vigorously on the gong at his side. "Come back here at once!" And when Goof rather sulkily appeared, he pointed excitedly at the wall. "Look, look!" commanded Kaliko. "It's Betsy Bobbin, the hungry tiger of Oz, and two others. What in mud is that fellow made of, anyway?" Rubbing his eyes, Goof stared at the wall and then at his master. Then, taking a scrap of paper from a rock desk beside the throne, he scribbled 2 words on the paper and handed it to the king. "You're crazy," stated the paper quite saucily. "How dare you write to me like that?" fumed Kaliko, tearing the paper in 2. "Are you dumb? Can't you speak? Are you blind? Can't you see?" He waved again at the great rock. Then, suddenly realizing that Goof had not the spectacles to help him, tore them off and clapped them upon the chief chamberlain's nose. Immediately Goof was as excited as Calico. "Hurrah!" exulted the little gnome, forgetting his determination not to speak to the king again. "Hurrah! Now we can have a war. Shall I call out the guard and have the red-hot dungeons heated? Ha, ha, ha!" "What are you laughing at?" exclaimed Kaliko as Goof doubled up with mirth. "That animated truck garden," panted Goof. "He's fallen on his corn ear and the hungry tiger just slipped into a mud hole." "Let me see," cried the king, snatching the spectacles back again. And for the next 5 minutes Kaliko and his chief chamberlain fought bitterly for possession of the magic glasses. As soon as Kaliko had them, Goof wanted to see how the travelers were progressing, and as soon as Goof had them, Kaliko insisted on having them back. "Well, shall we have a war?" grumbled Goof as Kaliko seized the specs for the 17th time. "Certainly not," answered the king. "Betsy's a good friend of mine. Don't you remember, she was here when Roggedo was deposed, and I see no harm in these others." "I thought it would be like this," muttered Goof in disgust. "You're such a goody-goody you never let us have any fun at all. I suppose you'll end by inviting them all to lunch," he finished bitterly. "Just what I was thinking of," admitted Calico cheerfully. "Pray go and conduct them the rest of the way, and don't slam the door when you go out, either." Settling back on his throne with a little chuckle of anticipation, Kaliko continued to watch the progress of Betsy and her friends through the winding corridors of the Lost Labyrinth. Betsy herself did not even know she was in the Gnome King's dominions. After a terrible tumble through the dark, the 4 adventurers had plunged into the underground pool of a grim grotto. While the water had broken their fall and saved them from serious injury, it had not added to their cheerfulness. "This is not the ruby that protects me from water," sputtered Prince Everett as Carter dragged him out of the pool. "Ugh! I'm nearly drowned!" "Have you still got it?" asked Betsy. The hungry tiger had already pulled her out and was helping Carter fish his wheelbarrow from the pool. Feeling in his pocket, the prince nodded. Then, picking up his sword, he looked around in huge disgust. "Is this a cave-in?" he demanded indignantly. "I wonder where this passageway leads," murmured Betsy, who had run to an opening in the grotto. "Maybe there's an inn after all." But there was no sign of an inn anywhere, only a maze of rocky corridors branching out in every direction. With Betsy and Reddy on his back, the hungry tiger stepped cautiously out of the grotto and started down the widest of the curious corridors. The floors were slippery with moss-covered rocks. The ceiling was of glittering green stones shaped like long, jagged icicles. Betsy and the Prince of Rash often had to lie flat on the tiger's back to escape their sharp points, while poor Carter Green was forced to bend double as he walked. Sure-footed as he was, the hungry tiger slipped again and again on the treacherous stones, and Carter's progress was a succession of spills, slides, and tumbles. Through it all, the vegetable man maintained his cheerfulness, stubbornly refusing to abandon the wheelbarrow, but after an hour of winding in and out of the dreary labyrinth had still brought them nowhere, even the vegetable man grew anxious and sad. A thin blue mold was beginning to form on the end of his nose. "If I don't get out of here soon, I'll spoil," he wheezed nervously. "Do you see any opening ahead?" The hungry tiger was about to reply when he slipped into the mud hole that had so amused Goof. This so discouraged the poor beast he said nothing at all. Indeed, the rest of their journey, while interesting to Calico watching comfortably from his throne, was neither interesting or amusing to the travelers themselves. When they came at last to an impassable rock wall and realized they must retrace their steps, Carter sank dejectedly into the wheelbarrow, and the hungry tiger lay down and panted with exhaustion. Imagine their astonishment when a door in the wall suddenly opened and Goof, bearing a blazing ruby lantern, appeared before them. "Follow me," commanded Goof disagreeably. "His Majesty has foolishly invited you to lunch."
"It's a gnome!" cried Betsy in surprise. "Why, we must be in the Gnome King's dominions."
"I was here with Dorothy and Bellina when we rescued the Queen of Ev and her 10 children, puffed the hungry tiger, rising to his feet. "Ruggedo was king then, but he's been put out of the kingdom, I understand."
"I wonder if Calico's still king,"
exclaimed Betsy. The little girl had had a whole book of adventures with Ruggedo, and had even been present at Calico's coronation.
"Oh, I do hope Calico's the king,"
she finished earnestly. "Well, if you're going to wonder and hope, stay here," grumbled Goof. "If you're coming to lunch, follow me." Without waiting for an answer, the crooked little elf turned on his heel and started rapidly down the narrow passageway. The hungry tiger looked questioningly back at Carter, and Carter looked uneasily at Betsy.
"Let's go," decided the little girl sensibly. "If Calico's still king, I know he'll help us."
"If he don't, I'll slice off his nose," declared Reddy, peering over Betsy's shoulder in an endeavor to catch another glimpse of Goof. He had never seen a gnome before, and as they hurried after the king's messenger, Betsy explained a bit about these queer rock-colored elves who live under the earth's surface and dig for precious metals and stones. They passed hundreds of the busy little men on their way through the rocky tunnels, and when Goof entered the underground castle of the Gnome King himself, both Carter Green and Prince Everard gasped with astonishment and admiration. Lighted with jeweled lanterns, spread with silken rugs, furnished with taste and even magnificence, the spacious caverns opened in a blaze of splendor before the visitors. The Gnome King's dwelling was an old story to Betsy and the hungry tiger. They were more interested in knowing who was king, and when the tiger, hurrying after Goof, burst suddenly into the throne room, Betsy gave a cry of real pleasure.
"Why, hello, Calico!"
cried the little girl, jumping down and running over to him eagerly. "King Calico, if you don't mind," whispered the gnome, looking nervously at Goofa, who was making faces at the hungry tiger. "How did you happen into these parts, my dear?" "We caved in," growled the hungry tiger, sniffing the air anxiously. "Is lunch nearly ready, old fellow? I'm perishing for a square meal." "Certainly, certainly," Calico answered politely. "But first introduce me to your friends. I've been watching you through my expectacles for an hour."
"Expectacles!"
exclaimed Betsy. "Well, I was wondering how you knew we were here." With a proud smile, Calico held out the pink glasses and explained how they worked, and, while the little prince and Betsy were still examining his specs, the Gnome King begged them to sit down and tell him the whole story of their adventures. "For I'm quite sure," surmised Calico, looking curiously from one to the other, but longest at Carter Green, "I'm quite sure you've been having some amazing adventures." Betsy nodded vigorously, and Carter grinned from ear to ear, which seemed to surprise Calico very much. Then, seating herself in a little rocking chair, Betsy told how the hungry tiger had been carried to Rash, of her meeting with the vegetable man, and the strange manner in which they had arrived in the same kingdom. Then she went on with Prince Everett's story, told how he had been deprived of his throne and robbed of the 3 Rash rubies. As Betsy described the magical powers of the stolen gems, the Gnome King leaned forward with sudden interest, and as the little girl explained how the vegetable man had come into possession of one of the lost rubies, Carter saw a surprised look flash between Calico and his chief chamberlain. Then he saw the Gnome King slip a small ring from his finger and hide it in a crevice of his throne. None of the others noticed Kaliko's action at all. Reddy was too interested in the gnome's curious cavern to bother about any possible danger. The hungry tiger's eyes had closed in a momentary doze, and Betsy herself seemed to have the greatest confidence in the king. "I'll have to watch out for all of us," decided Carter, hurriedly wiping the mold from his nose. And while Betsy continued her story, the vegetable man began to examine the king's cavern with great care. "We may have to leave in a hurry," thought Carter nervously. "Lend me those spectacles," mumbled the hungry tiger sleepily, as the little girl told Calico their intention of returning to the Emerald City as soon as they could, and having Ozma restore Reddy to his throne. "Lend me those spectacles." When the little Prince of Rash held them up before the hungry tiger's eyes, he gave a roar of delight.
"What do you see?" asked Reddy curiously. "What do I see?"
Purred the hungry tiger, licking his chops. "Why, I see that lunch is ready at last. Come on, fellows." "He's right," chuckled Calico, taking back his glasses, "for I ordered it an hour ago. This way, my dear." Taking Betsy's arm, the Gnome King led the way to his crystal dining hall, where one table was set cozily for 4 and another apparently for a dozen. "I haven't forgotten your tremendous appetite, you see," smiled Kaliko, waving toward the low table along which roasts of beef and legs of lamb were ranged in a tempting row. The hungry tiger gave a sigh of satisfaction, and without waiting for a knife, fork, or napkin began to munch his way hungrily down the table. For Betsy and the little prince, Kaliko had prepared an alluring luncheon of fried chicken, sweet potatoes, and peach pie. At the vegetable man's place stood a sparkling glass of root beer. "I didn't suppose you'd care to eat," observed Kaliko tactfully, "but I was sure you would enjoy our national drink." Carter was so touched by the Gnome King's thoughtfulness that he began to reproach himself for his unkind suspicions. Calico himself ate sparingly of a hot mud pie and swallowed a cup of scalding black rock coffee, and, while 10 little nimble gnomes waited on the table, he and Betsy talked over old Oz times and discussed means of crossing the deadly desert. "I don't know how you feel," yawned the hungry tiger when he had finally worked his way to the end of his long table, "but I feel like a nap." Betsy and the little prince admitted that they were tired too, and immediately Goof showed them to a splendid suite of guest caverns just off the throne room. The vegetable man slammed his door hard, then opened it quite noiselessly. Just as he had expected, the 2 gnomes had their heads close together. Now, when it comes to hearing, there is nothing so fine as a corn ear, and what Carter heard through his made him tremble with indignation. "If you weren't such a miserable mole," muttered Goof bitterly, "you'd get that other ruby." Chapter 11. The second rash ruby. "I told you there was a strange power in that ruby when you bought it from the fisherman," hissed Guff. "No ruby has an R carved in the side without some reason. It is undoubtedly one of the magic rubies of Rash, the one protecting the holder from danger by water." Several days before Betsy's arrival, an old Ev fisherman had brought a sparkling square ruby to the Gnome King. He had found it in a fish he had drawn up in his nets, and, knowing Kaliko's fondness for jewels, had taken it straight to the king. Kaliko at once purchased the stone and had it set in a small ring, the same ring Carter had seen him slip into the rock throne. "If you had the courage of a flea," grumbled Goof, "you'd steal the ruby this vegetable person discovered and become a real power in the land." "But it wouldn't be right," objected Kaliko, mopping his brow with his gray kerchief. "Besides, Ozma would hear of it and come with her army to conquer us." "How could she if you had the 2 rash rubies?" argued Guff. "How would she ever know? We'll just destroy all these rubbishy travelers and that will be the end of it. Where's the ring now?" he inquired anxiously.
"Safe enough," answered Calico, glancing over his shoulder. "I took it off as soon as Betsy mentioned the rubies. I was afraid she would notice it."
"Come on, then," urged Goof coaxingly. "Can't you be a little bad for once? 'Tisn't natural for a gnome to be good all the time, and where does all this goodness get you? Show you're a real gnome for once, and forget all this mortal stuff you learned from Betsy Bobbin." As Goof continued his wicked pleading, Carter stood frozen to the spot, his corn ears waving to and fro with wrath and indignation. He longed to snatch the precious ruby from its hiding place and dash back to warn the others, but the gnomes were so close he dared not move. But all at once Calico came to a decision and began to hurry toward a small door. "I will consult the wizard," muttered the Gnome King in a weak whisper. "Come, let us see what the wizard thinks about this." Taking Goof's arm, Calico went pattering down the rocky hallway. In one leap, the vegetable man reached the great throne, found the ruby ring, and dropped it into his leather pouch. He was about to return to his companions when the king's spectacles, lying on the arm of the throne, attracted his attention. Clapping them hurriedly upon his nose, he rushed toward the cavern occupied by the little Prince of Rash, but halfway there he gave a great leap. "Great cauliflowers," gasped Carter. As plainly as you see the pictures in this book, he saw Goof thumping the little boy on the head with a pickaxe. "Stop! Stop!" screamed the vegetable man, dashing into the cavern like a whirlwind. Off flew the king's spectacles and splintered into bits on the floor, and his entrance was so noisy, Everett jumped up in a fright from the couch where he had been sleeping. "What's the matter?" he demanded, feeling around sleepily for his sword. "Matter," coughed Carter. "Wasn't that rogue Goof in here?" The prince shook his head, and, looking into the next cavern, Carter saw Betsy curled up peacefully on a green sofa, and from the cave beyond came the resounding snores of the hungry tiger. "Nothing's happened at all," yawned Reddy. "It was the spectacles," puffed Carter, catching a glimpse of the pink splinters of glass at his feet. "Do you know what is going to happen, my rash young friend? That scalawag of a gnome intends to bang you over the ears with a pickaxe. I saw him with my own eyes and Calico's specs." "Bang me with a pickaxe," shuddered Everett, jumping up in alarm as Carter ran to waken Betsy and the hungry tiger. As fast as he could, the vegetable man told them all he had overheard, and showed them the ruby ring Calico had slyly hidden away from them. Their pleasure at recovering the second ruby was entirely spoiled by the treachery of the Gnome King, and, scarcely looking at it, Reddy thrust the ring into his pocket. "I can run the fastest," panted the hungry tiger. "Jump on my back, all of you, and I'll make a sprint for safety." Almost as one, the three leaped on the hungry tiger's back, Carter leaving his wheelbarrow with a sigh and arming himself with the spade he had picked from the Indus tree. But as the hungry tiger dashed through the door into the throne room, Goof and his entire army came swarming through another entrance. Calico, himself, was nowhere in sight. He had delegated Goof to secure the rash ruby and dispose of the travelers. Then, thought the Gnome King, if any trouble arose afterward, Goof would be held responsible. But Goof did not intend to have any trouble afterward. He meant to destroy the travelers so utterly that not even Ozma, with her magic, would be able to discover what had become of them. Therefore, when the wicked little elf saw his 4 victims preparing to escape, he gave a loud screech, hurled himself at the hungry tiger, and brought his pickaxe down with all his might upon the head of the little prince. It might have been a feather for all the impression it made upon Reddy, and while Betsy and Carter ducked back in dismay, the gnomes rushed at them in a body and simply rained blows upon their heads and shoulders. But the blows fell as harmlessly as an April shower, and when Carter realized this, he began laying about with his spade so briskly that the enemy went down in heaps. "One of the rubies is protecting us," whispered Prince Everett, pulling out his sword. "Take that, you gray robber!" And bringing the sword down on Goof's shoulders, he stretched him flat upon the rocks. At the same moment, the hungry tiger, gathering himself for a spring, leaped entirely over the gnome army and, charging out the first door he came to, raced down a long, dismal tunnel. They could hear the gnome scampering after them and, redoubling his speed, the hungry tiger fairly flew down the dim corridor. When a sudden turn brought him up against a swinging door, he went through like a shot and out upon a huge rocky cliff. "Whoa! Whoa!" quavered Carter, jerking the hungry tiger frantically by the tail. "Stop! Stop!" implored Betsy and Reddy both together. No wonder. Bubbling up from the cliff and hurling itself down over the rocks below was a shimmering sheet of flame, the highest firefall, to be perfectly exact, in the whole of Kaliko's kingdom. But the hungry tiger could no more stop himself than a barrel rolling downhill. With a roar that loosened 3 rocks and a boulder, he plunged over the cliff and down the firefall itself. "Ruby, Ruby," moaned the vegetable man, clutching Betsy and the little prince. "Do your work." The roar of the flames drowned out every other sound, and green and yellow tongues of fire licked out at the travelers as they were hurled downward. But so powerful was the rash Ruby, they were harmless as spring zephyrs, while the stones and rocks against which they bumped and bounded seemed soft as pillows. The tiger was falling head first, and somehow the 3 riders managed to keep on his back and hang together. Just before they reached the bottom and swirled down into the pool of flames at the base of the firefall, Carter lost his hold on Reddy's belt. He soon regained it, but not quickly enough. "My ears burn," complained the vegetable man, as the hungry tiger struggled through the flaming torrent toward the shore. "What's that?" questioned Betsy, sniffing the air suddenly. At the same moment, they were simply covered with a shower of crisp white flakes. "My ears," moaned the vegetable man in grief-stricken tones. "They've popped." This, on top of all the other shocks, was almost too much, and when the tiger had dragged himself out of the fiery stream and scrambled up the steep bank, they all dropped down upon the steaming rocks and simply panted with exhaustion. "First time I ever came down a firefall," puffed Reddy, gazing fearfully at the tumbling torrent of flames. "Well, it's the last time I ever come down one," growled the hungry tiger. "If it hadn't been for that ruby of yours, we'd all have been nicely toasted by now." "As it is," the hungry tiger looked sorrowfully at the vegetable man. "The best ears I ever had," groaned Carter, feeling the husks that were left to him. "Did it hurt?" asked Betsy sympathetically. But the vegetable man made no reply. "He can't hear you," explained the hungry tiger gloomily. "If I had that gnome king, I'd eat him." "He didn't turn out very well," admitted Betsy sadly. "But never mind. Reddy has another ruby, and we're in the upstairs world again." "That's so." "Maybe we're nearer the Emerald City than we think," rumbled the hungry tiger. "Let's look around a bit and see." Motioning for Carter to follow, and still feeling depressed over Kaliko's treachery and the vegetable man's sad loss, they started across the stony country, edging the Gnome King's dominions.
"It's funny Ozma doesn't help us,"
whispered Betsy to the little Prince of Rash as Carter strode gloomily and silently beside them. "I've been away from the Emerald City 2 days now, and she must be wondering where I am, and they have certainly missed the hungry tiger by this time. But how would Ozma know where to look for you?" asked Reddy. "The magic picture would show her," answered Betsy, and quickly explained the most magic of Ozma's possessions. "This curious painting hangs in the royal palace, and when Ozma wishes to know where her friends are and what they are doing, she has but to stand before it and request them to appear. Immediately they flash into view, the picture showing just where they are and what they are doing at the time. More than once, Ozma had saved her subjects from serious disaster by consulting the magic picture, and it did seem strange that she had not looked for Betsy and the hungry tiger. While Betsy and the little prince were still puzzling over it, they stepped across the rocky borders of the Gnome King's dominion into a pleasant farming country, and they were all so relieved to find themselves once again in more natural surroundings that they stopped worrying and began to enjoy themselves. The fields of potatoes and cabbages were especially cheering to Carter Green, and when they came upon a waving field of corn, he gave a joyful shout and sprang lightly over a fence. "Wait!" he called gaily, holding up both hands. "Wait till I pick a couple of ears." Chapter 12. Immense City. When the vegetable man returned with his new corn ears nicely adjusted, everyone felt more cheerful. "Can you hear?" asked the hungry tiger curiously. Carter nodded. "I think they're even better than the last pair," he confided happily. "It isn't everyone who can pick a new ear when his old one pops or wears out. Not so bad being a vegetable man, eh, Betsy, my dear?"
"No,"
agreed the little girl thoughtfully.
"and you haven't taken root for a long time, have you, Carter?"
The vegetable man grinned. "Haven't had a chance," he chuckled merrily. "We haven't stayed in one place long enough for that. I hope the next country we come to is calm and quiet, and that I can pick up a cart and some fresh vegetables." "I hope we can pick up a square meal," roared the hungry tiger, licking his whiskers hungrily. "I hope there's some magic." Clasping her hands, Betsy looked around expectantly. "Then we could cross the deadly desert and go home." "I kinda miss Dorothy and Ozma," she acknowledged wistfully. "And I'd like to see Hank." "Well, I hope we find the last ruby," exclaimed Prince Everett. "The one Calico had must have been the ruby that protected one from danger by water. You said he bought it from a fisherman, Carter." "Yes," mused the vegetable man. "It must be the one Irashi flung into the river, while the one I found was the ruby that protects from danger on the earth and under the earth. Look how it saved us from the pickaxes and the firefall. Then the only one left to find is the ruby that protects you from danger in the air," reflected Betsy thoughtfully. "Do you suppose we'll have to fly up in the air to find it?" "Not if I have anything to say about it," growled the hungry tiger, shaking his handsome head. "Falling is bad enough. Flying would turn my whiskers perfectly white. We'll stay on the earth if we can, and travel back to Oz by the fastest route we can find. Then Ozma can settle affairs in Rash, discover the whereabouts of the last ruby, and restore Reddy to his throne." "Can Ozma do all that?" marveled the little prince wonderingly. "Ozma can do anything," Betsy answered proudly. "Just wait till you see the Emerald City and Scraps and the Scarecrow." "Tell me about them," begged the little prince eagerly, and as the hungry tiger padded comfortably down the long sunlit lanes, Betsy told Reddy all about the jolly inhabitants of Oz. The vegetable man listened attentively, too, his new ears a bit forward and a dreamy expression in his kindly blue eyes. But right in the middle of a description of TikTok, the metal man, he gave a bounce of surprise.